Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we conclude a 5-day program on AI policy. Today, we'll be talking about parenting and AI, one of the most critical challenges, actually, as AI begins to take more pervasive hold of society worldwide. Before we launch into that very important discussion, I want to continue my commentary on what's going on in Gaza as the world bears witness to genocide of the Palestinian people. Over the past week or so, as I've been reporting, the Israelis have not taken mass action in Rafah. They've been just using snipers to kill people at random and drones to explode randomly in Rafah and also in Khan Yunis, the other town to the north, where they have almost completed the clearing, as they call it, of the town. This morning, a woman and 5 children were blown up by a drone as they were waiting for water. This just gives you an example of both the randomness of what's going on, the purpose of which is to strike terror, but also the reason why so many women and children are being killed in the overall devastation of the Palestinians. This morning, Israel time, just a few hours ago, the office of Benjamin Netanyahu announced that he was directing the Israeli Defense Force to prepare the final evacuation of Rafah so that they can level the city to the ground. It's worth just remembering for a second what we're talking about. Over the last 4 months, the Israelis have systematically carpet bombed Gaza from the north to the south. Gaza is about 5 miles wide. It's about 25 miles long. It was established many, many decades ago, and since 2007 has been turned into a concentration camp. People can't leave. People can't enter. Food supplies have been rationed at just above starvation levels. And so the young people have no idea of the world outside of Gaza, and they are subjected to relentless discrimination and abuse, as occasionally the Israeli army mows the lawn, as the Israelis refer to it. Occasionally, they just come in and bomb. There's no military infrastructure in Gaza, as there is none in the West Bank. There are no airports, no airplanes, no tanks, no jeeps, no troop formations. Hamas is an invisible presence with a few rifles, a few grenade launchers, rocket launchers, that they essentially keep underground and bring them up above ground and then disappear in classic guerrilla warfare technique. So that over the last 4 months, the Israelis have forced 2.2 million Palestinians south. And now 1.5, 1.6 million of them, depending on reports, are concentrated in Rafah, which up to October 7th was a Palestinian city. It's on the southernmost border of Gaza, adjacent to Egypt. 200,000 people are now crowded with 2/3 of the entire population of Gaza. Famine, starvation has affected 30 to 35%. Disease is rampant throughout the community. Most of them are living in tents without sanitation, without any water. And now the Israelis have announced that they're going to order the evacuation of all 1.5 million Palestinians so they can begin intensive bombardment of the city to gain total victory over Hamas. Brigadier General Goldfuss, who's the head of the IDF forces in that region, said there are no plans to spare the civilian population. The heart grieves at such deep levels over both the carnage on live TV, the refusal of the United States to do anything except Blinken and Biden running around wringing their hands while they pump all the weapons that Israel needs to do the job, relentlessly even bypassing congressional approval, refusing to engage in the most obvious move of diplomacy in the world, a ceasefire, which both the United States and the Israelis adamantly refuse to enact while the genocide continues. It's hard to know what one does with one's grief when expression is called anti-Semitism, when protest is called appeasement. And yet bear witness we must, and appeal to our leaders to create the conditions for a ceasefire we must. And as the next days and weeks unfold, we will continue to bear witness to one of the great crimes of modern history. And as an American, to know that my president, who I actually voted for in 2020 in good faith, is guilty of being a perpetrator of genocide, calls into question in my heart almost every assumption I've ever made about democracy in America. So thank you, everyone, for joining us today. These are extraordinary times. As I've said, sometimes we grieve as we are today. Sometimes we celebrate. Sometimes we explore. Sometimes we question. Sometimes we bear witness to what's happening around us, always in the spirit of truth pursued, not truth possessed, allowing the data to come in and, as Jung would say, move the vitals of our soul. So welcome. Now it's my pleasure to introduce my good friend and colleague, Georg Bach, with whom I've worked closely almost day by day for more years than I can remember, who's the director of technology at Ubiquity University, and who is passionate, both as an intellectual and also as a parent, about artificial intelligence. So he's been co-convening this program with Tom Eddington. So Georg, thank you, and I turn the program over to you.
Thank you, Jim. Welcome everybody to this final day of this wonderful week that has really been created by Tom. And it was really great to see the sessions and join in. It was very powerful. And the focus of this week was AI policy. And being a parent, and kind of living through this explosion of AI over the last year, but also seeing, the blossoming and the rapid development of my own children, I have two daughters, one is 3, the other is 6. It really made me wonder, right, what the future of AI in education, and especially what the future of the relationship of AI to children should look like. We know that AI can be whatever you want it to be. It is known that Israel is using AI-enhanced targeting for carpet bombing to maximize destruction and casualties. At the same time, we see that AI can be an extremely powerful tool to deepen our understanding and take personalized education to a totally new level. And so today I'm extremely excited to have this conversation with my colleagues and in 2 special guests I will now introduce. But Tom, if you're also wanting to welcome people to today's show, I would be great to see you and hear from you.
Thank you, Georg, and thank you, Jim. Yeah, it's been an extraordinary week. We've journeyed from conversations around human development and the relationship of where humanity is to the technology that's being developed, artificial intelligence, and what's the level of development that the people doing the coding for AI have, and what level of development are they putting into AI? We heard some pretty disparaging and discouraging comments from Eddie coming out of Davos on Tuesday, and conversations around how do we insert the right level of consciousness in the development of AI, and do that in the context of the Frankenstein capitalistic system that we're operating in. And we heard some wonderful positive uses of AI yesterday in compassionate AI. And I think where I'm left after the conversation this week is that, with all technology, it can be put to good, and it can be used in a very destructive manner. And I'll take a little side note, maybe as a bridge from what Jim was just sharing, to talk about last year in the state of Michigan. There was a teenager who showed up at school with a gun in his backpack, and he killed 3 of his fellow students. And he was convicted and charged and will spend the rest of his life in jail. And last week, his mother was convicted of 30 years in jail, and his father's on trial now. And yet the gun industry is completely free to go on doing what they're doing and cannot be held liable. And my fear is that with AI, the industry has already positioned itself to not be held liable. We saw Mark Zuckerberg and other technology folks in Washington, D.C. last week apologizing to the parents who lost their children due to suicide from social media. And so my desire, my interest in the conversation this week, and certainly the conversation today, is, as a father, I worry about the world that my kids are growing up in. And I'm particularly interested in this conversation. How do we ensure we end up with the right policy? How do we ensure that there are guardrails for the technology, for the safety of humanity? And how do we bring all of the gifts of AI? And most importantly, how do we ensure that our children are able to use the technology in the ways that it's intended for the benefit of humanity? So it's I think it's with a bit of a heavy heart I come into this conversation today and this week. It's been educational, it's been informative. I'm delighted to help put the program together, and I'm cautiously optimistic about the promise of AI.
Great. Thank you, Tom. I think it would be now a good moment to introduce our panelists officially. So we're extremely excited to have with us Sarah Richardson-Mealer. Sarah is the founder and CEO of Left Field's Lab, a creative technology firm dedicated to evolving human-centric design and engineering. She holds a degree in design for emerging media from UCLA and has over 20 years of leadership experience building digital, immersive, and experiential projects, platforms, and campaigns. Sarah is deeply committed to her teams and partners and actively cultivates an environment that supports mutual well-being. Her passion is rooted in creating meaningful impact through innovation, and she and her team collaborate with companies that share this mission. Combining masterful design and technology with a heart-led philosophy, Sarah and Left Field's Lab craft experiences with the intent to enrich people's lives, communities, and the world at large. Sarah, thank you for being with us today. It's great. And one should also say that Sarah is a mother. You have a son and a daughter, is that right?
Yes, I have a 10-year-old daughter and a 4-year-old son. So we are in the midst of the early childhood years.
Wonderful. And our second guest, who you may already know from previous Humanity Rising shows, is Griffin Deleuze, who is actually the co-founding CTO of Ubiquity University. And Griffin Deleuze is also a distinguished figure in the tech industry with a profound impact on AI, blockchain, and Web3 development. He has advised, influenced various Fortune 500 companies such as Apple, IBM, Microsoft, MasterCard. And Griffin is also actively involved in innovative projects in the social and fintech sector, such as Definitive VC and the development of meta chain and meta protocols. So thank you for joining us today, Griffin. And Griffin,
thank you, Georg.
Also is a proud father of a wonderful young girl.
4 years old.
4 years old.
Like Sarah's son.
Yeah. And as I said, mine are 3 and 6. And Tom, you're also a father. I didn't know that about you. They're older,
Yeah,
I guess.
I have two young adults, a son who's 31 and a daughter 29.
All right. So one of the stories I shared here in the green room, I maybe wanted to repeat for the audience that made me got me excited about the subject was it wasn't so much before ChatGPT, right? This question about technology and children has been very much on everybody's mind, right? Should we have tablets for young children? Is it a good idea? Too much screen time? This is a larger conversation. Where it got really exciting for me was when GPT-4 was released, I think last year, and you could all of a sudden speak to it. And my daughter, the one that's 6 years old, Cosima, she regularly spoke to Siri, but it never really got her too confused. It was always clear to her that Siri was just a robot thingy, that it was like very confined. You know, you could maybe get it to play her favorite song if you were lucky, but beyond that, it wouldn't get anything. But then all of a sudden, when I just for fun activated GPT-4 with voice, we wanted to do some riddles on fairy tale riddles, right? All of a sudden, she was amazed that she could speak to this so fluently and without any friction. And she was asking me, right, what happened to the iPad? Is there a person now on the iPad? Is this what is this? And then I was like in a position where, oh my God, now I have to take some kind of stance here. How do I present this technology that I myself have not fully kind of figured out my stance on to my children, right? And how should I implement this technology as they grow up? We all know it. It's more than likely. It is already clear that as they will go to elementary school and beyond, they will have some type of conversational AI tutor that will be pretty good at teaching them a lot of things. And so I was like, okay, should I tell her this is a person, a computer pretending to be a person? This is, I was confused. So I was like, what do we do about this? How should I frame this? And this is what I would like to start this conversation with you guys. How would you frame this?
It's an interesting moment in time because I think we look at, Siri and other more applications as transactional, where we ask a simple question, we get a response, or a command to adjust the lighting or set the temperature. Transaction is really different from the critical thinking and having more in-depth conversations that requires and elicits a two-way conversation that's very different. And I think our children are responding in a way where they see that difference. It's a really interesting situation, Georg, that you just highlighted. I haven't had that question posed yet to me because we really limit the use of media in our home. We don't let our children use LLMs yet. I know it's coming, but I think if I were posed with that question, I would really have to give it some serious thought first. So I'd love to hear, Griffin, what you would do, or if you've encountered that yourself.
Yeah, for sure. I've certainly been thinking about it, and similar to Georg, I'm somewhat dreading having to sort of explain what is personhood, right? My father's an epistemologist, and it's like I don't think I ever got complete clarity on that, so I'm not sure I'm capable of doing the same. But what I can do is I can sort of differentiate, because kids work really well with duality, right? You say, if you want to get them to do something, you don't say, do you want to do this? You say, do you want to do this or this, right? So from my perspective, I would differentiate any LLM or any AI from family members or friends, and really would be a stranger. And I think that's important because none of us really, well, very few of us really have a deep insight into all the possible directions that an LLM can go. I mean, we've all heard horror stories, many of which were constructed by journalists looking for a titillating headline. But I think a child can, can understand the difference between stranger and family, and I think that's important because, LLMs will evolve. And, we don't always really understand what direction they're going to evolve. I'm struck by a quote I'd heard recently where I was listening to someone who was British talking about the difference between how Americans school their children and how Brits who sent their kids off to private school typically did. And I think the quote was that Americans send their kids off to be educated by the children of strangers, right? Because essentially, once they get on the bus, or once they go through the doors of the school, you don't really have any insight or control into that except for what they tell you. And I think LLMs will be very similar. Similarly, my child doesn't have an iPad or a screen of their own, and all their screen time is supervised. She's 4, so how long will that last? Probably not much longer. But yeah, it's definitely an interesting question. What is a person? What is an AI? Is it family? Is it friend?
And it occurs to me we should probably back up because I know we're using the term LLMs, and a few have asked in the chat here, what is an LLM?
Or a
And
large language model. Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, large language model is essentially any AI construct that is compiled in a as a neural network derived from data arising primarily from the modality of language. And we're right on the tipping point now of moving beyond large language models into things like large action models, which are based not just on reading words, but on observing people as they're either using a phone or a tablet or a computer, or observing somebody on camera to learn skills like that. So, but for now, most people's exposure to AI is limited to large language models or to things like Siri, which are essentially constructed, and as we all know, have a minimal amount of actual utility beyond a certain
I'll
script.
just jump in. I'll just jump in real quick and just make an observation that when I first moved to the Bay Area back in 2002, cell phones were just starting to emerge in a in a more ubiquitous way. And I remember having lots of conversations with parents about, and my children at the time were 10 and 8 years old, and having conversations, when are you going to make a cell phone available to your kids, and how much time do you allow them to do gaming? And this was before online gaming. And the people in the tech sector, by and large, would not allow their children access to the technology, because they knew the perils of the technology. They knew what was in the technology, so to speak. And the parents who didn't have access to that information were happy to make the technology available. And Sarah and Georg and Griff, I'm hearing the three of you talk about policing and restricting the technology because you know what's behind the technology.
Yeah. I think it helps also to think about our generation as we were, in grade school and high school. We didn't have access to the devices, of course, but we sometimes forget that. And it's just good to remember. We didn't even have email addresses yet until, at least for me, I was in my first year of college. So, we made the conscious decision when my daughter, my eldest, was born, that we would provide her a Waldorf education. And I think that was actually has been quite common, especially in Silicon Valley. And that is a no media education, or very, very limited media. And the idea behind that is that instead of interacting with devices at an early age, we're really fostering our inherent creativity and curiosity. And we're really appealing to and nurturing those essential human qualities and conditions, without the imposition that technology can create. And I think it really served well. Now with my son, it's different. We're not in Waldorf any longer, and he has a lot more access to watching content on Netflix. So, there is a bit of a difference there, and we're already seeing it. And, the ability to play, free play on his own. I really do see a difference there. However, I do think in technology, we know, as you pointed out, Tom, how perilous it can be, and how destructive to our innate intelligence, curiosity, creativity. Those are the things that are so essential to safeguard as parents.
Yeah, one thing I'm struck by is, my generation, in my experience as a kid born and raised in the 70s and 80s, was my parents would actually turn off the television at the fuse box, which did little except encourage an interest in household electricity management for me. And I would, turn it back on and then rush to turn it off before they got home. And I have those memories, deeply ingrained. Days of staying home sick and like watching Bewitched or something like that. And so my child is also in a Waldorf program, which, does stress no media. I have to say I'm probably not a Orthodox Waldorf, parent, because, we do allow my daughter to, do yoga on the, dinosaur yoga or whatever for toddlers on the iPad and things like that. But very rarely do we leave her, with the screen, on her own, right? She's usually like right there doing yoga or something like that. And Little Bear, the show that, is the show of last resort when we're at a restaurant and she's, throwing a fit before, entrees have arrived. So I guess I think that, that's the closest parallel that we have growing up. I mean, cell phones for sure, I remember, I've had every cell phone, growing up because I was always into that sort of communication. But I think that the difference is, media is essentially, for our whole life, pretty much one way, right? I think a closer parallel might be, as Tom said, the telephone, right? Like, or chat rooms or something like that, where, you wouldn't leave your kid alone in a chat room, on AOL in the 90s or something like that. And I think, AI LLMs are similar. I think it's going to change, though. I think it's going to change very quickly because we've already seen the rise of open source or, local models, which are, and I think Apple has been you know, uh, incredibly silent on this whole issue. I mean, they did release Ajax, which is a developer model to compete with ChatGPT, just to sort of dip a toe. But I think, Apple has such a reputation for, valuing privacy and essentially being kid safe and that sort of thing, that we'll probably see something come out from Apple. I think they've been distracted by their Vision Pro, which is the, mirrored ski goggles thing that basically is their entry into spatial computing, or VR, AR. But I think we will see something probably this year from Apple in that regard. And I think that that's one of the issues that they'll probably focus on, is like, how do you know that an AI model is safe for your family, for your kids, to keep your data safe, that sort of thing.
And the reality is now we're all figuring it out together. And it is, a bit of a Wild West, because what is safe? And there are brands and companies and big tech that we know adhere to certain privacy security guidelines, maybe more so than others. But it does require a level of discernment, and also self-education too, in the latest, and discovering also for ourselves what are those parameters that we're willing to make concessions around.
Yeah. I think from a software development perspective, people tend to associate safe with not being surprised, and having friends who've gone into, companies like Apple and done things. The mantra is, don't change anything unintentionally, right? Anything that changes the user experience can sort of, let sleeping dogs lie, essentially. And I think that from our perspective, safe probably means like, you know, I don't think we're nearly as safe as we think we are. We have no idea how much data is floating around on the dark web about, I mean, some people are starting to understand that, but most people don't. So I think in this instance, safe would mean, that there's a general domain with, and I think things like app stores, when we essentially have, and now Sam Altman and OpenAI have released this concept of GPTs, right, which is essentially an app store for AI. And I think they're sort of piggybacking in the same way that, television piggybacked on radio and film on television, and, et cetera, et cetera. They're piggybacking on this idea of an app store where you have essentially an understood domain, a generally understood domain, that if I download this model or if I run this GPT, it works with this. It works with my, budget data, or it works with, kitchen recipes or something like that. And if your kid was sitting down trying to get a recipe for oatmeal or pancakes, and all of a sudden they were like, seeing, political news about, I don't know, or like instructions on how to build a nuclear reactor, that might be exciting for some people, but generally would be surprising, and so might not be considered safe.
Well, in preparation for today, Georg, you had raised the question, and I'd like to bring it into the conversation now. We're all finding ourselves in a situation where, not only are we parenting our children, but we're, being asked to parent AI. And I'm wondering what, for each of you, what that means around this responsibility of co-parenting the AI as well as your children.
Well, I would love to think that we have agency in co-parenting the AI or in training the LLMs. Not all of us are directly. I'm not directly. We at our team at Left Field, we are building AI tooling and implementation of LLMs. However, in the application of that, I do think that there is some pretty strong guidance. We do have agency in seeing how things are applied in the real world, and looking at these opportunities and situations with a greater level of discernment. I do believe that we have such a responsibility as technologists alive right now in this unique time in human history to really use our tools wisely and responsibly. So I just wanted to state that. There are many parallels with parenting, especially young children, as three of us on this panel today have parents of young children, and many parallels with the developmental stages of what our children are learning and are experiencing, how they're growing, and how AI is also growing in tandem. And then there are also things that are very different about it too. I think the big theme that I'm seeing, and I feel personally, is balance. Because what I see with parenting is that it is requiring balance. You need to have parameters. You need to have clear, let's say, guidelines or rules. If you can imagine a situation in a household where there were no rules, think of how terrifying that would be for children, and think of the chaos that would ensue, and nobody benefits. Same thing, I think, applies with AI. If you have no parameters and no rules for those to follow, it's a chaotic environment, and the end output is, I would say, a disservice to humanity. So I see what is essential is that balance of parameters as well as some freedom to move about the cabin. And defining what that balance is the big question for us, so that we as creators can operate from a similar blueprint. Griff, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the topic.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting because I do sort of think about model creation or cultivation, really, in that sense of like, actually, it's for me, it's less like parenting and more like sort of crossbreeding plants and things like that. As you're controlling, garbage in, garbage out. So you're controlling what goes in, especially with today's models, which have a fairly limited context window, which just means that, you're often working with an increasingly small number of, especially as OpenAI starts to throttle down, their service level in order to, spread the, limited number of GPUs that they have, across all their, the limited amount of compute that they have across the increasingly infinite market for intelligence, which is basically what they're selling. They're selling intelligence. If you give them $20 a month, they give you access to, basically all of human knowledge, at least in the English and Roman character set. But, if you're starting to work with your own models, which is increasingly possible right now, I mean, you can essentially do something like use RunPod. RunPod is an online service that lets you basically have as much compute as you want on demand, sort of like an Amazon Web Services model. And then you can run these models that have previously only been running in places like Google data centers or, Meta data centers. You can do that. You can sort of have your own laboratory where you cook up these models, and how you define the context and what they call fine tuning, which is essentially what are you emphasizing? Are you creating like an accountant, or are you creating like a chef? Or are you creating, what are you doing? Are you creating a personal assistant? What you put into that really matters because it influences what you get out. And so I guess parenting is probably an apt analogy, and increasingly so as we start. I mean, Apple, for example, with their and Samsung, Samsung with the Galaxy 24 just released AI on the local device. So, for example, you can translate between 13 different languages now. So if you're standing in France and trying to order at a bakery, you can whip out your Samsung Galaxy 24 and you can talk. Now, there have been apps to do that for a long time, but they have usually been dependent on a cloud. They're usually not using the local processing power of your phone. And Apple's in a great position because their Apple Silicon essentially has something called a neural engine that has a huge capacity for doing that sort of thing. Previously, they've used it to make your photos look good, but moving forward, they're going to use it to power all these AI apps that are going to emerge in this ecosystem. I think that we'll probably get that level of curated experience through an app store before most people start to, cultivate or curate their own AI models. But I think it's only a matter of time until we're essentially having an AI like a Jarvis that's, working with our family and then knows everything that your spouse said that they, need from the grocery store, or, what your kids said they want for Christmas and things like that. And it's going to be interesting, at what point, do you say, that thing that just happened, we don't want that to be top of mind for the AI. So we're going to roll back to another version and an earlier version. And if you do that, are you actually killing off the family pet? I mean, it gets rather surreal rather quickly.
Well, if I would be a bit cynical, Griffin, I wouldn't be surprised that if Sumi would have some kind of Waldorf GPT that's uniquely designed to help children explore Waldorf concepts in education, such as, doing crafts with natural materials or dancing their name.
Yeah.
And I mean, that sounds kind of absurd, but you could also argue that it would be a democratization of this type of competence and patience and caring to large amounts of people who would otherwise sit their kids in front of, I'm being cynical again here, sit in kids in front of the TV and let them watch just passively stuff.
Yeah, not only that, but I mean, if we look out a little further over the horizon, the idea of TV and entertainment, you know, I've, you know, we've all gone through the writers' strike, you know, in Hollywood, and the actor strike and Screen Actors Guild, and I've gone through it twice. I started something called Strike TV during the previous strike, but you know, we're on the edge of essentially having your local computer running some models, maybe some legal, some illegal, that can generate, you know, 500 episodes of, like, you know, whatever your children's favorite animation is, Little Bear, or, you know, if they're teenagers, Rick and Morty or something like that. And, you know, how is that going to influence our society when essentially you're sort of looking into this hall of mirrors from an entertainment perspective? And like, how are models incentivized? Are they incentivized just to titillate, or are they incentivized, you know, as you say, to like emphasize like the Waldorf you know, perspective or something like that? Yeah.
I think it would be also helpful for our viewers to talk about and maybe bring perspective around what are good applications for children in AI. You know, I recently saw the Khan Academy's coaching that's AI enabled, and that was a turning point for me to see an output that I think does bring some benefit. So what this experience is essentially is a private coach, but uses a more Socratic coaching method, asking the child, what do you think about this? How did you arrive at this solution? And really providing a more guided way of arriving at the thinking and answering a particular problem. So I'm seeing things like that are of big benefit. When you think about what it looks like potentially to have a private coach for every child, that's groundbreaking. Is that a benefit?
It's
You know,
huge. And
yeah, go ahead.
yeah, well, I'm excited by that for more than one reason, but one of the killer features is going to be the capacity for multimodal input. So, you know,
Exactly.
you know, we're all sitting here in front of a webcam or something similar to that, and you know, the ability for an AI to do, and you know, Zoom, if you do thumbs up, can interpret that, right? But we're fairly close to, you know, an AI model being able to see when you furrow your brow, you know, maybe you don't understand something, and so it, you know, there's the original, when I was CTO at Ubiquity, you know, we were tracking something called, I think it was the Newton project, where, you know, it would essentially design a custom pedagogy based on a student's, you know, unique capacities. You know, Howard Gardner has a model that, you know, tracks not just visual learning or auditory learning, but 7 or 8 different modes of learning. And so the ability to be a tutor, but to present information in many different modalities, that's going to be huge. And when we have AI models that can not only track visually, but track the tone of voice, you know, and that sort of thing, that transforms education.
Absolutely. Multimodal pedagogy, not just for input, but also for output, of course. And you hit the nail on the head. We all have different learning styles and needs, and some more extreme. And when you look at neurodiverse learning needs and different forms of engaging with content, that has profound implications when you can think about the ability for AI-enabled ed tech platforms to truly customize the way we are teaching and the way we're learning. And you know what we mean when we talk about multimodal pedagogy is that there are different forms of interacting with the content. Some are visual learners, some are more audio, and some, you know, need that simultaneously. And there's so many other forms there for greater accessibility. So it's a really important aspect and attribute to underscore that I think is a massive benefit here. It does help to level the playing field with creating greater access to learning opportunities and engagement, and offer it in ways that I think has not been accessible for the majority of our population, especially for young learners. So that's something that I'm most excited about, and I look at with optimism, and I do feel that we have a great degree of ability to do something really unique with.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe picking up on that conversation, Griff and Sarah. For me, both of my children were diagnosed with the dyslexia at a very young age, and so the challenge I had as a parent was trying to find an educational environment that would meet their needs and to help them learn in a style in a way that supported their learning differences. And it was challenging. It was challenging for both of them, and to help them understand that this here in the US, the educational system, based off of Henry Ford's assembly line, let's get as many people through the educational system as possible in a mass production sort of way, wasn't serving them. And it was the system that was broken, not them. And so the promise of what you're describing is incredibly exciting.
It
And
is.
yet the challenge I'm concerned about is for each of us as parents, our responsibility is to know our kids and to figure out what are the guardrails that are appropriate for them so that they can learn, they can fail, they can learn from their mistakes, and yet not make mistakes that will haunt them the rest of their life. And I'm wondering if the three of you can speak to both of those, that customized educational opportunity and the ability to figure out what are the safe and right guardrails for our children.
Yeah. The first thing I would say personally is looking at these AI services as sophisticated tools, not a complete replacement for. And that's how my personal view has been formed. I know Noam Chomsky talks about, AI and LLMs as snow plows that allow us to do the greater work than we've been able to do before. On the topic of our education system, it's a really interesting point you raised, Tom, because it has been developed in, post-industrial revolution, or, to really train workers with a certain mindset and skill sets. And I know Sir Ken Robinson, education reformist, had talked quite a lot about our needs to reinvent, and we still are grappling with this. And I think it comes back to our earliest discussion on what makes Waldorf education so unique, really appealing to and applying to our innate skills as individuals and what our inherent gifts are, and really fostering learning modalities that bring about more of our innate skills and less of this sort of ubiquitous training, one size fits all. That's been a big part of the challenge here. So if we look at the big picture, I think, as how do we use these as enhancements to, and not binary A or B replacement of, that's where I think we get into some solutions that can actually derive great benefit.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Griff.
Go ahead, Gore. It'll keep.
Cool. Yeah. So, I mean, the question that poses itself to me is a bit, how can this new AI world, where each child will have a personal, is it a teacher? Is it a friend who can explain things in their language? This guide, let's say learning guide, let's call it that way. How can this learning guide coexist with the current school system that will probably not change in any way, shape, or form as quickly as the technology? And then the worst case scenario I see is that school system will not change, and AI will just put it the same old kind of paradigm on steroids, so that, yeah, you get more homework and this AI will help you understand stuff at home, but it doesn't really change the actual paradigm of where it's not about knowledge transfer, but it's more about, training these competencies. And I think maybe it would be great to talk about these 5 C's that have been coined as 21st century skills, right? I know, Sarah, you're also passionate about the importance of critical thinking. These have been developed by Mazola Randlers. There are several papers on this. And yeah, I'm wondering if these could help us steer this conversation.
Absolutely. And, I think that someone in the comments has asked about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I think that that prompt, Georg, goes hand in hand with that. What makes us human and what are the core elements of the human condition and needs? And I do think a lot of this falls into that category. When we look at then how do we enable greater sense of collaboration? Well, it stems from, in my opinion, feeling safe and feeling as though we belonging to our immediate community. And it may be within, the safety of our classroom, where we feel that we can contribute and speak up. These all tie back to what makes us human and the things that we need in order to be healthy, productive members of our community. So, I often have thought about how do we create potentially, an education tech platform that helps to foster some of these critical thinking skills and also our sense of connection to one another. And not to take us on a tangent, but I think it might be related. I think that now that we're working remotely, and especially with my company, we have a greater sense of disconnect with one another, and our sense of awareness of each other has really suffered. Our empathy, therefore, really begins to waver. We're less accommodating and maybe less likely to pull in the extra time to help a colleague because we don't have that sense of awareness around what their real struggles are and what their obstacles or barriers might be. And so taking a bigger step back around how can we provide some of these innate needs to the human in a world where we're increasingly disconnected. I'm really curious about how we might be able to cook with the ingredients that we have available to us to deliver something that actually enables versus creates more of the same problem. And I do think it's possible. And I know this isn't me just practicing altruism, because I see how this shows up and I see that it is possible. But it does take a great level of thought and care. It takes the right type of partnership and have some certain amount of pragmatic risk taking, I think, also to identify that there's this massive problem that we have in education system, but also in the global workforce today, where we suffer from a lack of productivity and a loss of revenue, therefore. So if we can really apply to some of these innate needs, I think that we've got something that the world can really benefit from.
I can imagine a dystopian AI kind of future for my children in which they are lured into this very fruitful pseudo relationship with an AI that can help them learn and kind of seems like their friend, but it's in the end not a true human connection, and it doesn't allow them to truly develop their capacity to relate to other human beings in the way that they should. So that's kind of my fear, that by enabling them to create, by allowing them to just develop this relationship with AI, I'm inviting them, or I'm kind of luring them into something that they might be haunted by, as you put so succinctly before, Tom. Is this something that could haunt a generation, just like social media is haunting the previous one in terms of creating a potential disconnect, something that we're not evolved for, like the race, if we speak about social media with the race to the bottom of the brain stem, is there such a thing in AI where we just get addicted to this artificial otherness and we in the end become more lonely than we were to start with? This is my fear.
It's a rational fear, and I think that it's important to ask ourselves, how might we engender greater mindfulness in young minds and in young learners. It's difficult in present day. I think that we operate typically and at majority in a bit of a hypnotic trance as we engage with media in different forms of tech applications. Sometimes we underestimate the innate critical thinking skills and needs, and we don't foster that enough. And I think the big question is, how can we approach greater mindfulness and foster more of that with young learners? And, you know, I used to think that the currency of our rising generation will be creativity and curiosity, as we have, you know, machine learning and ability to compute no longer are our math skills quite as essential. You know, the things that have been valued as critical. I've thought, well, creativity is really what will separate us. And now I really think our social and emotional skills are the new currency. I think our ability to relate to our fellow human beings in a thoughtful and healthy, productive way is going to be an even greater skill set that we should cherish and really embrace. So that's my personal perspective. I think that kind of goes back to your prompt there, Georg. But yeah, Griff, I'd love to hear your thoughts too.
Yeah, Catherine Alexander made a great point about creativity in the chat, about creativity being potentially disruptive, and the idea that society tends to filter out disruptives and thus creators. I think it's valuable to think about the idea that, to sort of divide all of our media and all of our social interactions and technology into this concept of centrally controlled versus decentralized, especially now, because we're in many ways at a tipping point where, our society is essentially recreating the concepts of, truth, information, disinformation, malinformation, money, value, all of these things. And there's a real struggle between, the centrally controlled ideas of this and then decentralized or ground consensual truth. If we look at the technology that we're talking about, AI, we can sort of superimpose that, through this idea of like centrally controlled AI models where, there's the great moderator in the sky, Microsoft, OpenAI, Google, et cetera. And then, we can see, just a little further over the horizon, this sort of app-driven world of, people cultivating, curating, creating their own basically silicon persons through these very large language models, but not just language driven models, yeah, my thoughts are a little bit ahead of my mouth here, but I guess what I'm thinking is that the tension that comes from this sort of duality and sort of balancing this duality, or the pendulum swinging back and forth, in many ways is what drives society forward. And we see that with things like cell phones, right? I mean, pretty much everyone has a cell phone in our civil society right now, something that's probably about $1,000 to $1,500 worth of silicon electronics that's subsidized through your egregiously large data bill from Verizon or AT&T or T-Mobile or whomever. But as intelligence starts to move to the edges of every device, to where you talk to your microwave or your refrigerator or your one of your many computers in your life, I think that the emphasis shifts more and more to the software. And so we'll have this sense that there is an AI person or a crowd of, I mean, we're very close. In fact, right now, this idea of teams of agents is at the cutting edge, where you're not just talking to one model, you're actually dealing with like 7 or 8 models that are handing tasks off to one another. If you want to have somebody file your taxes, well, you have one that, handles all your expenses, and one that does the actual interface with the website, and one that asks you questions like, hey, didn't you stop by a bookstore and buy a journal on that trip to, Orlando? And so, how long was that? Anyway, that I think the idea that, there is one truth that is moderated from on high is going out the window really, really quickly. And the idea that, this technology is going to be something that we, think of as a technology is also going out the way. Arthur C. Clarke has this great quote: any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. It just becomes invisible, and it becomes something that we don't think about anymore. Maybe it becomes a verb, like, why don't you Google that for me? Or why don't you ask? I mean, I think we will have a world where there will be, AI influencers and AI models that are just subject experts on something, right? And maybe there'll be, a dozen subject experts on something. But I think that's an interesting world. And I think it's a more interesting world than one where, we're sort of left to fend for ourselves and argue about, news or fake news or whatever. And so that to me is compelling.
And that's such an interesting point, because I do, again, think it comes back to that balance of there's the machine, the artificial intelligence, and then there's the human discernment. And, I see a scenario, and I hope, again, this isn't being overly optimistic, where we're still the ones at the end of the day to make the final decision and make informed decisions based on what the LLMs are, the data they're culling and providing us with. And that balance of human interface and involvement is, final decision makers. I'd like to think that that carries through in most of these applications too.
Yeah. One other thing to think about is, I love Kerrigan's question: who will mediate when I get into a conflict with my refrigerator? Funny. So, um, the idea that, we have a team of advocates is a much more empowering idea than we have. Like, I mean, we're so used to this idea of there's one Internal Revenue Service, there's one Federal Reserve, there's one, person in the White House, et cetera, that and it's always the other, right? It's at arm's length. It's them, it's they. Well, they say this, they say that. I think we're on the tipping point of really being closer to we say this, because, if you look at our whole democracy, right? I mean, I think it's illegal in a bunch of states to actually, like, take a photograph of your ballot and share who you voted with. There's very much a divide and conquer ethos that's superimposed on our democracy. And it's by design, right? It's essentially because we're ruled by a very small number of special interests. And so it's going to get to be really interesting when we all have not just one AI, but maybe a dozen different models working on our behalf. And this idea of agency and moving into an agentic era, Freudian slip, where we have, essentially somebody who's arguing for. Here's an interesting example. If anyone's ever gone to traffic court and represented themselves, it's like it's pretty comical, right? Because the whole system is essentially designed to extract, the $180 or whatever, probably in Biden bucks, it's like $280 now. But, trying to represent yourself in that system is comical, right? But if you have your AirPod in your ear and, you have one of 3 or 4 different attorney models running, and you can basically, run rings around the system, that's going to be an interesting world to live in. And, when every political dissident and, every citizen of a republic has that capacity, that's a really interesting world. So, yeah, the idea of like us versus them being replaced by, we, meaning a consensual truth, that gets interesting really quickly.
And I think it goes
Yeah,
back
maybe
to,
picking up on that. Oh,
go
go
ahead.
ahead, Sarah.
No, you first.
I was going to say, picking up on the interesting world that we're living into. I'll date myself a bit, but coming out of college, the expectation was I would go work for a company and they would be my employer for the rest of my career. And when my children were heading off to college, the schools they selected, the promise of the education they were going to get was, we're going to help you be creative thinkers. We're going to help you be curious, and we're going to help you navigate a 5 or 6 career adulthood based on curiosity, based on creativity, based on critical thinking. And my children now, as I mentioned, are 29 and 31. and they're sitting there saying creativity, critical skill thinking, and curiosity are not a guarantee or not an insurance policy about employment. And where can I look for meaning in my life while also support a lifestyle that I'm looking to live. And so particularly for the three of you as parents of younger children, how do you think about their future?
Yeah, I can jump in here. I think it's all about understanding their unique capacities and letting those finding ways to make them thrive, or finding them in the first place, right? So I love this idea that the previous school system of what we understood as school was basically learning facts and then regurgitating them, often ways, or having a very kind of limited box in which to paint in when it comes to recreate an argument. But what's happening with AI already is that kids are invited to much more kind of cognitive flexibility, and it's something they have to develop anyhow in order to make any sense of the world. So it reminds me a bit like what it's like to go up with several languages. You know, we have this unique capability when we go up to learn several languages at the same time, and there's this cognitive flexibility that we don't even know what we're capable of as human beings. So I'm saying there's also this potential for a total leap in human capability at the intersection of AI and in human cognition that is then really going towards this vision of augmented human intelligence and less something artificial that stands next to it and mingles with it. And that's maybe a positive outlook or a general framing. I want AI to amplify my kids' unique capacities. That's what I want.
If
I
I
don't
could,
want it. Yeah.
yeah,
Go
I just
ahead.
want to pick up on that point that you were making, Georg, about, you know, being essentially monolingual or bilingual, and the empathy that arises from that, the capacity to shift cultural context. My own daughter is bilingual. My wife is Bulgarian, so I see that difference
Yeah, I
between.
see too. Mine is
Yeah.
Mexican, so I
Yeah,
was.
yeah. And I think what's interesting is that, you know, to a large extent, our educational system has basically been built on this sort of special interest, like as Tom says, the sort of, you know, Ford assembly line concept of educating, or education as incarceration. You know, basically, you know, you go from every time the bell rings, you go from here to here, and you do something at that station, essentially. And how that's being replaced with, you know, especially in, you know, institutions like Waldorf education, or things that are less structured, or, you know, structured around, you know, a different embodiment of education. If we do live in this world in the future where, you know, we have room for more than one truth, right? If we have, you know, different perspectives, and we have the ability to, you know, see a media piece and then simply say, hey, Jarvis, you know, show me this with fact checking from you know, libertarian perspective, or from a, you know, conservative perspective, or from a, you know, Ethiopian perspective, or something like that, that builds in a whole new mental musculature of perspective. And I think that's what's missing from our society. And when you introduce that, I think it becomes much harder to get people to just, you know, in a sort of Pavlovian sense, accept war, accept us and them, accept divide and conquer. And so I'm very optimistic about that shift. And I think it's a good thing for humanity, and especially in education, where if you're, you know, if you're neurally divergent, or you don't happen to fit the specific model of the educational institution, you sort of become alienated at that point forward. I know I was, you know, moving forward.
Yeah, you know, an interesting topic that comes to mind, Tom, is one that you've explored throughout, and it's, you know, the creators of LLMs maybe not being as diverse as we would like and hope or would need. And I do think that the solution also lies in a greater diversity of LLM contributors, where we have diverse thought, experiences, backgrounds. And also, I think not just approaching from an engineer-centric point of view, it's really critical. We've talked a bit about, and someone raised in the comments, the deeper C's: consciousness, caring, compassion. Now, when we look at that, what comes to mind for me is spirituality, or philosophical belief, or values, or human needs, or Maslow's hierarchy, and those are the things that we don't often apply when we are building instances of technology. And if we don't think about those things, then we're going to get more of the same and homogenous circumstances and outcomes that don't really cultivate those deeper C's. It's so important, though, that we're bridging that as technologists, that we, I say typically heart-centered, or, maybe it's faith-based, or maybe, philosophical. But I think that it's really important that we're asking ourselves these more critical questions as we create, and we have a greater diverse population of creators. And you're right, Griff, to point that it's in the application, in the fine-tuning as well. It's not just those that are contributing directly to the creation of the LLMs, but it's what we do with these tools that I think brings about a groundswell. And even if we're not creators directly, as participants of this conversation, as viewers, we also have agency, and there's a ripple effect that, when we interact with or choose to interact with certain tech, we're able to guide the course in a way that I think we sometimes underestimate the power. And we've been having conversations like this. So diversity of creators is so important, that we continue to bridge those two worlds, so we can get better, more holistic outcomes.
Yeah. In the spirit of creativity, I think it's interesting to consider that, most technological revolutions go through multiple stages, right? And a lot of them are driven from above or, below, from a government perspective. I mean, for example, the internet was created by DARPA, right? Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. It was designed to, essentially ensure the, flow of communication in the event of a catastrophic event like a nuclear war or something like that. But I don't think the creators had any concept that it would basically, undermine the entire cultural control system of media that had been constructed at great expense over many decades, by the CIA and other players. But, the pendulum tends to swing back and forth. And I think that when we look at, a lot of the causes of our current concerns, about things like fake news or, real news, that you can sort of trace them to that, that tipping point between central and decentralized control. I think that right now we're sort of have, I don't know, 20 years baked into us of this concept that if Mark Zuckerberg decides that, you are dangerous to, the global culture, then you'll be de-amplified, right? I mean, we've seen that in things like the Twitter files. What I think powers that be have failed to realize, though, is that we are novelty-seeking creatures, right? It's built into our immune system, right? If you're walking through the forest, you see something red, you turn and pay attention to it. If you hear a rattlesnake, you turn and pay attention. You don't think about it. You've already jumped before you've even realized why. And I think culturally, as a large global population, we will increasingly be concerned with the well-being of the outliers, right? I think that we're either going to descend into some dystopian Orwellian future where everyone is essentially poor except the 1%, or we're going to arrive at some sort of universal basic income to replace that, which is lost by all the automation created, not only in knowledge workers, but in labor and, taxi drivers, semi-truck drivers. So we're going to have to essentially reinvigorate civil society economically and politically. And once we do that, I think now we're here in America, you and I, we're not in the EU or, places where there is, certain safety net, from a medical perspective and things like that. And we tend to fund a lot of wars, as Jim was saying. I think that all those ground rules are open for debate once we and it doesn't take much. It's like the idea of like maybe 10% of society says, no, this is no longer acceptable. We are concerned with what's happening in Africa. We are concerned with what's happening in Gaza. We are concerned with this or that. And, I mean, you see things like CNN struggling to get ratings in the face of things like Joe Rogan, which is just ridiculous, the amount of reach somebody like that has. Once we all have, half a dozen AI moderators, working to our benefit and collaborating, right, among one another, I think tribes of interest just emerge naturally. And so I think the cat is out of the bag, the horse has left the barn. This agentic AI technology that can run on your phone is in the wild now. We just haven't really seen the natural, evolution of that. But what I'm saying is I think it's going to move in the interests of compassion. It's going to move in the interests of concern for, I mean, if you just think about the idea, if it bleeds, it leads, right? If I work for the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and I know that that's what titillates, that's what sells newspapers, right? I think that influence can be harnessed for good. And I'm looking forward to seeing what that world looks like.
I very much agree. And it comes back to our creativity, because if we can't imagine a world like that, we're not going to create one. And that's why it's so important as creators that we can imagine and cultivate these applications that are practicing altruism, that have benefit not just for the individual or for the company, but for global communities. It's so, so critical.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm struck by this point you were making about perspective taking, and I'm also intrigued by the idea that maybe there is some kind of fundamental goodness baked into the nature of kind of the core essence of what makes us intelligent, in terms of curiosity, wanting to learn more, mirror neurons, and if we can amplify that very childlike state, of beginner's mind in a way, or I would even say innocence, if we can amplify that, that would be quite a ride for everyone involved.
One point on that is that we're very much still in the early days of all of this. The sufficiently advanced technology has not yet become invisible, right? But we are like literally right on the edge. And I'm both, excited about it and somewhat dreading it. If I didn't have a kid, I think I'd just be excited about it. But the idea of putting on Tim Cook's, Vision Pro Air or whatever the not $3,000 to $5,000 version of it is, like the $500 to $1,000 version. That's intriguing, because if you can, I mean, I've sometimes thought about the idea that our basic modality of interaction from an entertainment perspective or from a news perspective really hasn't changed in like 2,000 years, right? We're all sitting here staring at a screen, right? We're looking through this digital porthole at one another and, the 5 or 6 of us here. But it gets to be very different when you just put on an AR headset or something like that, and we're all sitting around a campfire, right? And we're rendered photorealistically, and you have spatial audio to the point where Georg is on the right side of me, Sarah's on the left. That taps in very deeply into the human nervous system and all of the muscles of empathy, and that's a much more interesting world. And when we think about the idea that for the first time in human civilization, you'll no longer be limited to interacting with somebody, not only in the same, geographic location as you, but when you have real-time AI-driven translation, making somebody, I mean, there's this phenomena that, if somebody's speaking Portuguese to me and has sort of like, broken English, the temptation is to talk louder as if they're deaf or dumb, right? But when everything is translated, and we just saw this with, I think Argentina's Milei, right, gave a rather provocative presentation at the World Economic Forum, and there was an AI translation of that into English that used his actual intonation and voice, and it became very compelling in a way that it wouldn't be if you didn't speak his language. I think that's going to be really interesting when every voice on the planet essentially has that same level of fluency. I mean, they say that the last 10% of fluency is wit, essentially, that you really don't get jokes until you're completely fluent, right? But when everyone essentially is able to sort of like get the joke and sort of realize why whatever's happening is ridiculous or something else needs to happen, obviously, that becomes a much more interesting planet to live on.
Unless you're German, you're just not funny.
Yeah.
Can't help it. Yeah.
Well, on that note, Georg, should we bring Jim back into the conversation?
Yeah, I think it
to
would be
wrap
a
up?
great moment. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Wow, I'm a little bit at a loss here, just taking in the nuances. But one of the things that was just rising up in me as I've been listening to you is, particularly when you think about parents and AI, this instinct to protect our kids from AI. I was remembering back, Tom, to Monday's discussion with Eddie on his report from Davos. And I think it's worth just bringing in for Sarah and Griffin's comment that the prevailing ethos among the governing elites is transhumanism, the fusion of technology and humanity. Elon Musk, with great fanfare, announced, what was it, last week, that there's the first human implant of whatever it is he's putting in people's brains has been accomplished. And you have Yuval Harari and Klaus Schwab and Singularity University and basically, Silicon Valley, all celebrating this possible transhuman future. But like in Davos, you have, as I've heard, over the years, the people who know the most about social media, et cetera, in Silicon Valley do the most to protect their kids from it, right? So in that, Sarah and Griffin, what was being reported on Monday about Davos is that during the day, they're celebrating what's going on, and during the night, they're anguishing about what's going on. But because you can't do anything because the cat is out of the bag, well, let transhumanism prevail. So I would love to hear both of you as parents, speak about this emerging consensus among the upper 2% of the elite that currently govern planetary affairs, whether this vision of transhumanism is something that you as parents would endorse or not. Are we headed into a world in which we're all cyborgs of one kind or another, but we embrace it because that is who humanity is now becoming?
I hope not, Jim. Jim, I don't know if you remember this, but 24 years ago, you introduced me to Google's chief scientist who wrote the book, The Singularity is Near. Blanking on his name right now. Do you remember who I'm talking about?
Ray Kurzweil.
Yeah, Ray
Yes.
Kurzweil. Right. It's the same day. It's the same day we met Mikhail Gorbachev, and you introduced me to my wife. So thank you for that.
It was a good day, man.
Yeah, it was a good day. Yeah. The idea of transhumanism has, to me, always been one of those poles on the sort of pendulum of, and I've always thought of institutions like Singularity as sort of that holding down the territory of that pole. And there can really be no light without casting a shadow, and no shadow without a light, right? So I think this transhumanism, trans literally means like across or beyond or through. Right. And I think it's a misnomer. I think that, the idea that you have to replace carbon with silicon, right, in order to sort of take the next step in evolution, I think that's an error. Now, I know Elon would say that, the problem is thumbs are just too slow. You sit and maybe that's true if you're a quadriplegic, right? And if you have the capacity to if you've lost the capacity to speak or to walk, and then I think there's a very good reason for augmenting, carbon with silicon. And I think we're going to see that very quickly. We're going to see people who could not speak speaking. We're going to see people who could not walk walking. And I know I will shed a tear for that for humanity and in compassion and celebration for that. But I have no desire whatsoever. I'm very attached to my body, and I don't want anything, interfering with that. And I think that you don't really need it. If you think about the idea of augmenting humanity through, the user interface that we've all been using for time immemorial, right, which is speech and hearing and seeing things. And if you do get AI that essentially know what it is that you want and can become agentic and can act on your behalf, then why would you need to become the AI? I mean, that's kind of like taking your car. If you want to detail your car, you have to become the car detailer. No, you have to spend $25 and get somebody to detail your car, right? So I think it's overblown, although I think it does, sell books. Yeah.
I agree with you, Griff, on that. I think that typically we've come from a mindset that we need to seek the answers outside of ourselves, when actually the answers reside within.
Good
And
point.
and I feel that is the era of transhumanism. It's the old era that we've just come from, not the new era that we have emerged into. And this new era and really tapping into our interconnectivity and how interrelated we all are, and the fact that we all reside in the universe and the universe resides in each of us. And we have incredible abilities with that and responsibilities too. There's a ripple effect and an impact that each of us makes. His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, talks about the relationship of technology and spirituality are meant to be in unison and coexist. And I believe this is really the time that we're in right now. We need to challenge ourselves in constructive, healthy ways and ask these questions. How might we create with this set of values? How might we see more beneficial scenarios as outcomes of the technology that are simply the tools in our toolbox? Not the be all end all, and not replacements for aspects of the human experience. How do we create and bridge a deeper sense of connection with one another? And when we can come from that mindset and approach and apply that with each other and for each other, that's where we get some really amazing results. And I will continue to hold that flag and create those situations with my company.
Just to make one final point on this idea of tools, right? We're very used to, after decades of having to struggle initially with things like copy this and all that sort of stuff, and using our fingers on our cell phone. We're very used to having to change ourselves and wrap ourselves around our tools. And what's easy to forget, but important to remember, is that for the first time in history, our tools are actually mimicking us, right? And they are now. Siri is no longer Siri. Now we're talking to GPT and things like that. They're now able to understand us sometimes better than we understand ourselves. And I think that shifts the entire dialogue about transhumanism. Yeah.
Good point. Good point. Good point. Tom, what do you think about this matter of transhumanism and the human future? And then Georg, you can comment and then wrap us up.
Yeah, I think it, touching on something that some of the content that Michael Putz introduced on Monday and some of Sarah's comments, there's the bigger question of the nature of reality, and a recognition not in the trite phrase of we're all connected, but just that sense that we are all, descendants from star beings, the universe. There is no Tom, there is no Jim, there's no Griffin, there's no Sarah, there's no Georg. And what's being presented to us with AI or with the UAP issue or climate change is we're fundamentally being asked, who are we? And what's the nature of reality? What's the nature of our being? And it's an astounding time to be alive.
Yes. Good. Star beings.
Wow. Yeah, Tom, getting goosebumps here. This is really, I'm very happy with the way we're landing towards this end of this conversation. I think what we brought in terms of distinction between, I would say, augmented human intelligence or unleashed human potential, as opposed to artificial intelligence replacing the median human, whatever it's supposed to mean. This is this terrible framing that was put out by Sam Altman. I don't know why he did that. And I think this is really the poles we're kind of navigating here. However, I do believe that as Neuralink or other kind of brainwave technologies and AI comes further along, there will need to be a line must be drawn somewhere, right? We will have to make a deliberate choice this far and no further, because it seems to be that having a technology that's more than a tool, that understands us, helping us, can only go this far before it replaces us. And we will have to make a collective decision how far we want it to go. And if we try to bring it back maybe to this world of education thing, I think I don't know too much about that framework, but I know that Steiner was very much at its core concerned about humans as spiritual beings, right? That could not be reduced to computational computation, right? And I think like the bigger issue that's on the horizon is if we would use human interaction to something that can be computed, aren't we eventually giving up the spiritual essence that is beyond that, right? And that's a larger question, but I'm wondering if we should create a Waldorf GPT, if that wouldn't be perverse. And we'll have to figure that out together, I guess.
I think Steiner would cheer you, Georg, if you were able to pull off Waldorf GPT. That would be great. Thank you all so much. And just as a closing comment on my part, by way of really expressing deep gratitude for the quality of this week, Tom and Georg, and the quality of this conversation today, I'd like to just pick up, Tom, on your last remark about this deep awareness that I think will come more and more comprehensively as we enter our extraterrestrial moment, that I'm not Jim, you're not Tom, Sarah's not Sarah, Griffin isn't Griffin, Georg isn't Georg. We're stardust. We're a miraculous coalescence of stardust. And I think that the more we understand the grandeur of what it means to be human, the less we will need the crutch that humans have needed in all of their history when they feel inadequate, of something external to them, a neural implant, a religious ideology, a political tyranny, something external that will make it all okay. That always is a measure of your own lack of self-esteem. And I think that the beauty of this moment for me in history is that humanity stands on the threshold of not only understanding what it can do destructively, but what it can do constructively in terms of reinforcing the brilliance of what it means to be human, and therefore how we can continue to deepen our inner sense of value to such an extent that the external applications of our genius never enslave us. And that seems to me to be the deeper calling of artificial intelligence, is actually a deeper realization of what it actually means to be this beautiful coagulation of stardust called humanity. So I really want to thank you. This has been unbelievably inspiring, everybody. And so that brings our week to a close, sadly. And by the way, it's Chinese New Year.
Happy New Year.
Starting tomorrow. So let us celebrate the Year of the Dragon.
Yeah.
And then next week, we're going to have Carson Kelly, who came in through Tom, do a whole 5-day program on human flourishing in the age of modernity. So that's next week on Humanity Rising. But Griffin, Sarah,
Oh, thank
great
you.
stuff, man.
Thank you, guys. Nice
Thank
to meet you,
all for
Sarah.
having me.
Thank you,
Great.
Tom. Thank you, Griffin. We'll see
Thanks, Tom.
everybody in the
Thanks,
after
Stan.
chat, and we'll
Thanks,
see
Jim.
you next week for Human Flourishing on Humanity Rising.
Happy
Bye,
New Year.
everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.